Everyone. I know some folks are still joining us, so let's get started. I want to thank you for being with us today for this really important conversation about hospitality in our region. My name is Jack McDougall, and I'm President and CEO of the Greater Washington Board of Trade. We launched this business briefing series back in March 2020, just when the COVID virus was starting to spread. And since then, we've hosted more than 35 webinars for our members and partners across the region as a way to share expertise and gain new insights in managing through the pandemic. I'm really pleased that nearly all of our members and organizations have participated in these briefings, and I want to thank everyone who has joined as a speaker, sponsor, listener, or contributor. Not many of us really expected things to drag on now for more than a year, and finally there's some light at the end of the tunnel. You know, the pandemic's affected all of us and was really challenging for essential workers, especially those on the front lines, healthcare in particular, and many, many others. As industry sectors go, leisure and hospitality were decimated in our region, losing nearly 78,000 jobs between October 2019 and October 2020, the highest of any sector. This, along with so many small businesses and restaurants closing. Now, as vaccine rates increase and new cases decrease, we're starting to see some restrictions lifted, which is good news. And still, we have a long way to go, and we need to accelerate efforts to reopen and get even more restrictions lifted. Though it is worth noting that we've added a few more Michelin-rated restaurants to our region, so that's a bit of good news. So with all that, I'm really pleased to welcome our terrific panel this morning. They'll discuss and answer questions about the state of hospitality today, the lasting changes that we can expect, and the path to recovery, and how can we get to a lucrative summer. As we get started, I'd like to introduce our presenter, Dyllis Hesse. She's the Senior Managing Director with Accenture, focused on travel and hospitality. Dyllis, I want to thank you very much for your support and participation and for being with us this morning. Dyllis is going to provide some background to set the stage for our discussion, and then she'll facilitate a conversation with our panelists. Erika Alexander, Chief Global Officer, Global Operations for Marriott International, Max Fisher, Vice President and CFO at MGM Resorts International, Kathy Hollinger, President and CEO of the Restaurant Association of Metropolitan Washington, and Susan Lacz, Principal and CEO at Ridgewells Catering. I want to thank all of you very much, and I know you've all been through so much this past year and many months. As a reminder, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature, and we will get to those at the end of our conversation today. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dyllis to get us started. Dyllis?
Jack, thank you so much for your stewardship on behalf of the industry. There's never been a time like this that we need it more, so thank you. Hopefully you can see the presentation, the slides that I'm sharing today. We as an industry team, when we looked at the situation last March and we saw the companies just decimated in terms of having to shut their doors for an uncertain period of time, we got together as a team and thought through how can we forecast a potential recovery. And so given the uncertain situations and the way events were unfolding, we realized that it was incredibly difficult to forecast. And so what we ended up doing was laying out four different scenarios in terms of how we could see market recovery, particularly in the industries across airline, hospitality and hotels, catering and restaurants, how that recovery could take shape. And what we quickly saw is as the virus spread and time passed, the first scenario, remarkable recovery, this kind of hockey stick K recovery, was not going to happen. There was not going to be an immediate return to 2019 levels within 2020, nor within 2021. However, as we also saw time passing and we started to see the vaccine creation and ultimate approvals come out and then distribution, we also saw that we were not going to the other end of the spectrum of our scenarios, which was the darkest days, which was, many companies just being long-term impacted and market turmoil happening. And so we did start to see things come towards the middle spectrum. And so as we've tracked the recovery in terms of the large businesses in this sector. We've seen that there is a period of kind of collective coexistence. We recognize that now the virus is not going to go away. There will continue to be variants. However, our perspective is that as long as the vaccine rates and herd immunity rates continue to tick up, as Jack outlined at the beginning, we are going to need to coexist with this situation for a period of time. However, we are forecasting that towards the back end of 2022, we could see significant recoveries in line with 2019. And so if we could go to the next slide and look at what the important thing around consumers are saying. We've been really keeping in touch with consumers throughout this entire year and doing a survey almost on an every other month basis. We've run 10 different pulse surveys with consumers, thousands of consumers across the globe. And we're listening to what they're saying, and that's helping to guide our forecasts as we look to forecast the recovery. And when we look at what consumers were saying back in January, just this year, January 2021, you saw that consumer sentiment around being comfort level with traveling domestically was at about 23%. 23%. Now that was up from in the previous year of around 16%. When you look at this chart today, you'll see in the middle column, traveling domestically, without the vaccination, 50% of consumers are comfortable with traveling domestically. And when you look at consumers that have already been vaccinated, that dramatically ticks up to 62%. So I think that this chart gives us all positive hope that as the vaccination spreads out beyond the 30% of the total population that it is today, we're really going to see people want to get back to normal activities from 2019. When you look at another interesting fact for this audience here, everybody who is in hospitality and restaurants and catering, when we look at what consumers are saying in terms of what do they want next, 79% of those consumers are saying that they want to work from a third space, that they are not just, they're wanting to get out of their homes, they're wanting to find a third space to work before their offices reopen, and they're wanting to do that in restaurants, in cafes, in hotels. And so that is an opportunity for all of us in the industry to think about how we can cater to some of those consumer demands. If we could go to the next slide and look at, we look at airline data as a leading indicator for the sector in terms of how people are traveling and how comfortable they are to get out there and travel beyond their home. And so when we look at, back in May 2020, there was just record lows in the industry, as you're all aware. This is TSA, the green line is the TSA checkpoint traffic to the airports in the US. And what you see is, of course, as of summer last year, you see this dramatic rise back to something like 20% of levels from the previous 2019. And then you see a bit of a plateau through the summer through to Christmas. And what we saw then, starting in March this year, is all of a sudden we're seeing a dramatic tick up. We're seeing a dramatic increase in traffic through the airports, and you're seeing a corresponding increase in both hotel occupancy now to about 60%, which is probably the highest that it's been for the last year, and also in terms of pricing. So the hotel ADR is about $112. And so you're really seeing an increase, a dramatic increase, which is good to see. And when you look at what airlines are saying, they're going to be operating this summer, planning to operate around 90% of 2019 levels. And you've got some quotes there from both American and United CEOs to say that they're planning to be back in the summer, which is really giving us good news and hope for the summer. If we move forward, however, we do see the recovery come back in different ways. And so, we do see this incredibly pent up leisure travel. People want to get outside their homes. They want to see friends and family. And so really from a leisure perspective, we're seeing that already come back strongly, especially in areas in the South US, like in Florida. We are seeing, on the other hand, business travel, a very hesitant return. We do think that that is going to take longer to return. And then groups and events is somewhere in the middle. We're seeing, obviously leisure-focused groups and events around sports, around family reunions, probably come back sooner in the summer. And we're seeing business events and meetings probably take a little bit longer to come back. And so just some data points to give you on the next slide is some data points to give you in terms of business travel and leisure travel. And so what we are seeing is that business travelers, there's some reasons to be pessimistic about business, but there's also some reasons to be optimistic. In terms of the pessimistic first, we are seeing that 46% of business travelers are planning to reduce their travel in the future. Many people are saying that they're not going to be 5 days a week traveling. They may only be 1 or 2 days a week traveling. And so you are seeing also companies, especially larger corporate companies, they are hesitant to bring people back into the offices and to bring people back to traveling until there's a view that the vaccine is broadly distributed and their workforces are safe. I think the other thing is they're offering a huge amount of flexibility. So you see some of the West Coast tech companies like Salesforce, Google, Facebook, et cetera, really offer continued flexibility to their workers to be able to work remote. And finally, on the side of pessimism for business travel, you have seen that this reduction in travel spend has really improved certain companies' profitability and performance. However, on the other side, the reasons to be optimistic about the return in business travel is, ultimately vaccine distribution is continuing to grow. 73% of business travelers say in-person meetings are more effective than virtual meetings. We would all love to be doing this in person, I'm sure. And 90-something% of business travelers do see that their growth in their business is tied to in-person interactions. So that gives you a little bit of a flavor of the mixed message around business. On the leisure side, as we see here from this chart, people are wanting to make trips. 58% of them are more likely to make leisure plans and leisure plans in the summer. We're seeing that tick up every single month as we come closer to the summer. And this quote from Jamie Dimon here from JPMC is that many consumers have more disposable cash because they haven't been traveling, and so they do want to be in a position to be able to spend it. And you're seeing Goldman Sachs talk about GDP growth of 8%, which just means there's more cash available in the economy. It may not feel like that, of course, but it's our job to try to find people and attract them to come and back into the industry. So maybe if we could go to the next slide, one of the biggest challenges that we see is that there is just an incredibly fierce competition for labor right now. Unemployment rate has dropped from the 14% in April. Now it's around 6% as 1.5 million jobs were added in the last few months as businesses begin to reopen again. However, labor participation rate is the lowest level that we've seen it at 61% for the last 40 years. And really here what we're trying to call out are some of the challenges that we know many of the businesses in this industry are facing, and that we're trying to figure out how do we address these concerns. Because on the bottom here, you can see this need for stability. The industry has, of course, as Jack said at the very beginning, lost more than half of the workers and they've been exploring new industries. They are continuing to look for new emerging skills, definitely people with technology and data and analytics. People are wanting to build their skills in new areas. We're also seeing the challenge that the industry faces is, obviously we have to deal with the challenges around the safety regulations that have come out and being able to reopen safely, both for our employees as well as the consumers. And finally, I think this is the most, one of the ones which is most difficult to deal with is that there is a much more demand for flexibility. Many of the schools are not open, especially in the greater Washington area. And so our workers are really needing flexibility to be able to handle the environment and the demands that it's putting on them. And we're seeing that 42% of employees are actually willing to make a trade-off on pay to get those flexible hours. And even more important is that, or more challenging, is that 20% of the workforce are saying that they want to step out temporarily. So, these are real challenges that we're all facing in the industry that we need to find creative ways to get around. And so if we could just go to the next slide and sum it up, I know that many of you have been doing, so many things to continue to right-size your businesses and to continue to survive through these incredibly challenging times. The other things that we think are important as we look to bounce back into the recovery is to really continue to work on the flexibility of the cost model. You've all had to significantly shrink to survive through these challenging times. And we think that unfortunately there is some level of volatility that will continue. So having a flexible cost model will continue to be important. Tapping into this demand in the leisure market is going to be critical. We know that in the Washington, D.C. area, a huge percentage of the revenues of this market are tied to domestic tourism and international tourism and leisure tourism. And so really to continue to tap into that, because that is where the growth is going to be, particularly in the short term. But doing more also to attract the workforce back into the industry. That is going to be key to help us be able to recover and serve the consumers that are wanting the services. And then finally, be very targeted in terms of the bets on the business traveler, because we do see that business traveler is likely going to come back at the very earliest Q4 of this year and likely be significantly less into next year. So with that, I'd like to thank you for listening through the presentation and open it up for the panel discussion. I'm super excited to welcome with me today Erika Alexander, the Chief Global Officer for Global Operations at Marriott International, Susan Lacz, the Principal and CEO of Ridgewells Catering. Hello, Susan. Max Fisher, the VP and CFO from MGM Resorts. Welcome, Max. And Kathy Hollinger, the President and CEO of the Restaurant Association of Metropolitan Washington. Welcome, everybody.
Hi, Dyllis. Great to be here.
Thank you.
Great. Well, so maybe Kathy, we start with you. I shared a little bit of thoughts in terms of our perspective of what's happening across the industry. Would be keen to hear from you from a restaurant association perspective. The businesses have been devastated by the pandemic. How have you seen the industry adapt, and what have you seen the biggest shifts in consumers and consumer behavior to be over the last year?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Delighted to be here. It was very interesting. So as an industry, of course, it was very clear that food service industry, particularly the independently owned and operated restaurant community here in the region, we were devastated. I mean, everyone was devastated. But what was so inspiring was the pivot that happened, not only on the operations side with the restaurants, but how consumers also aligned with that pivot. While restaurants had to rethink their business models, they had to take the full service on-premise dining model to a more on-demand, comfort-based, meet the diner where they're comfortable kind of model through more takeout, more delivery, alcohol to go, which was hugely successful and now wonderfully permanent in DC and Maryland. We're working on it in Virginia. We found that restaurants, while they were able to meet those new demands, we had to really be mindful of how they were able to keep the costs low to meet the new demand. Many full service restaurants, they did not do delivery. They did not do curbside pickup because the experience was not one that traveled well to have someone pick it up or eat it at home. But as we saw, diners were becoming personal chefs at home. They were using ingredients from restaurateurs and menus from restaurateurs. And the parallel in terms of how those two came together was pretty phenomenal. What our job really was to make sure that while these restaurateurs were incredibly innovative, how do we keep the cost low for them to help them through issues like third-party delivery and capping those fees, knowing that a pandemic is really no time for any service to be gouging an industry. Like, we all have to meet each other where we are and be able to get through it together in a very mindful and thoughtful, kind way. That was one of the ways in which we helped on the cost side, but also just creating new lines of revenue with alcohol to go. It truly saved our industry at a minimum to be able to pay their very, very modest teams that were now in place to be able to offer the services that were allowed at that particular time.
Thank you, Kathy. And Max, maybe from your business perspective, how did the pandemic affect your business and the consumers that you serve?
Sure. Thank you, Dyllis. The pandemic has affected MGM and the casino industry as a whole dramatically. Just as Kathy mentioned, at the onset of the pandemic, every casino went through a closure. So we closed our businesses and were closed across the United States, for a number of months. In the DC area here, MGM was closed over 3 months. And as we all could imagine, it's a massive impact to, not only our workforce, but also the communities, that we support. As Kathy mentioned, I think the resiliency and the, determination and drive of a lot of creative people. We worked tirelessly to reopen these businesses over a course of months. And by, this past September, we had at MGM, all of our businesses across the company and enterprise reopened. From a positive standpoint, the pandemic brought about a situation where once we have these businesses open, there really were not a lot of other entertainment options. Still to this day, we're struggling with how to, restart concerts and sporting events and things of that nature. And so, Dyllis, as you mentioned a couple times, people want to get out of their house and they want to have fun. And we were an option and able to provide that source of entertainment to them. And as we've kind of continued forward, the casinos have been able to do very well, despite as many industries and the restaurant and other businesses are under extreme restrictions. We've been able to do exceptionally well in our recovery of that specific line of business. From a customer standpoint, it's been interesting, and Kathy mentioned it as well, just the idea that customers are so willing to make changes, as everything they do now, everything they encounter is different. They've had to make changes from how they go to the grocery store to the doctor. And I think it's really no different in terms of how they engage with us in a hospitality environment. They've been very appreciative to have, I think, something to do, as well as being willing to adapt as we've had to adapt throughout this process. We've seen things such as, our customers that span across many, demographic layers. From an age perspective, we've seen a lot of our older consumers have been slower to come back and visit us. We've seen, on the other hand, that we've had substantial increases in visitation from those that are the younger, maybe more willing demographic in the younger ages. What's interesting to me is we're seeing a strong return and seeing more and more people come out, especially over the last. And really, as you mentioned, Dyllis, there's a substantial amount of savings out there that's going to make its way back in. And, we're very optimistic as we go forward, about customers' willingness to continue to come out. Definitely seeing from the customer a strong desire and interest in cleanliness and personal space, things that they tell us, things that they note if we're not on our game. And we have made many changes to our business that align with those things, but obviously as well, things that are good changes for the future, as we've had to, really rethink pretty much the entirety of our business and going through this change.
Thank you. Thank you, Max. And I think you mentioned also previously that you've seen you've made some changes that you think you're not going to go back from, right? Which is, making some changes on the properties. I mean, I'd love to hear also, Erika, from your perspective, what are some of the innovations that you've had to drive as you respond to changing customer dynamics and needs through this pandemic?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Dyllis. And this is gonna be a whole lot of yes and to what both Kathy and Max said. A lot of what we've experienced, of course, is, quite similar to what we've been focused on forever, cleanliness, health and well-being, safety, taking care of people, while they're in our hotels. But clearly we've all had to up our game. But the other thing that we've seen is this real expansion, of who's traveling. We talked about, leisure. Of course, you mentioned this in your presentation, leisure leading the recovery. Although I'll just give Kathy some assurance that for those of us who did try to play personal chef, there are many of us who failed at it, and we cannot wait to get back back into restaurants. I mean, some of us did not have a very good experience with it, so we can't wait to get back to some semblance of normalcy. But for us, there are a couple of ways we've tried to innovate. And one is, of course, from the outset, we launched a Global Cleanliness Council, which really helped us to incorporate, the science of reducing virus transmission in our operating protocols. We've rolled out, enhanced technologies in our hotels, including things like electrostatic sprayers, which really use the highest classification of disinfectants, recommended by the CDC and WHO. And, we were already, pre-COVID focused on, digital adoption, the need for contactless solutions that help make operations, more efficient. Clearly, COVID has sped that work up, really accelerated that work. And so we're really using or leveraging, contactless technologies to help, reimagine the guest experience. I mean, just some fun facts. I mean, think mobile check-in, mobile checkout, these phones are so critical. It's how we live these days. In 2020, more than 10 million times customers skipped the desk completely and checked into our hotels, using their telephone. They sent us more than 2.5 million chats through the Marriott Bonvoy app, and more than 3 million service requests came through the app. And to the point we were talking about how people are eating differently, mobile dining, we've got more than 200 hotels. You can order food through the app. And so I think what that means is cleanliness and disinfection, of course, as a part of who we are in our DNA, that's going to stay. And things around digital adoption and contactless experience, I think we're going to continue to see expansion in those areas, and that's going to stick.
Great, thank you, Erika. And I mean, I think, from one large business to more of the smaller owned business, Susan, do you want to share a little bit about how, this pandemic has impacted you, as well as also how you've had to innovate and some things you think are going to stick moving forward?
Yeah, thank you, Dyllis, and thanks for having me here today. Yeah, so immediately things started canceling like crazy. I think our last event was a marketing event that we hosted at Dock 5 on March 13th, and even that we pivoted to have that more of a Q&A in the industry about, well, we'll probably be shut down for 2 weeks or so. Well, here we are, 14 months later. We immediately, furloughed almost 90% of our staff. And we already had a system in place to have pickup meals and deliveries. So we put our protocol in place for COVID for our internal people, and as well as when we were delivering in contactless deliveries. So that immediately picked up, because if you remember back in March and April, it was hard to find groceries. You know, they were barely open. You couldn't find bread, milk, and toilet paper. So we got into automatically getting the things that we needed out to the consumers. So that business thrived very well. So the pickup and the contactless delivery, for sure, that was great. And just as a side note, year over year, from last Easter, Passover, you know, we were 50% down this year from last year, because grocery stores are open. Restaurants want to, also we're doing carry out. It took the restaurants a little bit longer to get on board to the program of delivery and pickup. And so, you know, we were down 50%, but yeah, we started shipping boxes. We were curating cocktails. We were making special nut mixes, you know, things that we could ship that weren't perishable. And we shipped almost 6,000 boxes over the holiday season, because people wanted to pretend that there was some sort of get together. So that our old laundry is now our global shipping headquarters. So that's one thing that was new to us that we know really nothing about. And lastly, like, we did some Zoom classes, and we would ship, like, clients wanted to get their employees together. So we had pizza kits or a sushi kit or something along those lines, so that they could all get online and cook together. So just a few of the things that we had. I mean, we were 87% down last year over 2019. And we're hoping that the fourth quarter, which is historically our busiest quarter, will pick up. The phones are definitely ringing. And I know we're going to talk about this later, but each jurisdiction is a little bit different on how many people can be at an event. So, you know, we're optimistic. We always thought 2021, our first quarter, we'd be back into it. And now it's looking like 2022 first quarter. So fingers crossed.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, we're all forecasting and fingers crossed for a faster recovery. Kathy, as you look to the restaurant industry as a whole, how are you thinking about the recovery? I mean, I shared some of our perspectives from an industry point of view, but how are you looking at it from a restaurant perspective?
Yes, you know, we, if I could, before answering that, if I could just give Susan so many kudos, because I was actually the recipient of a lot of those boxes, a lot, you know, a lot of those dinners, virtual dinners, cooking with people. She really represents the pivot that happened in a remarkable way. So kudos to you, Susan, for that.
Thank you.
You know, recovery, what it looks like, what it may be short-term, long-term, we are trying to be rooted in gratitude on some level. I will say that, you know, when you look at the country, we are faring slightly better because of the neighborhood focused region that we are, and restaurants who are the anchors of those neighborhoods. However, I do not think that anything on the recovery front can happen until we are taking steps forward to open further. We see that people and businesses can open safely. This is an industry that is used to and required to adhere to the highest standard of health protocol. And there is no recovery without opening beyond the modest opening that we are, at least in DC. Maryland and Virginia have taken steps forward. But you know, what we see, what we hear when I'm driving around, when I'm eating around, there is consumer demand. People want to be out and they want to eat out. And much of what you talked about, Dyllis, earlier, that's going to increase with vaccination. But I will say, first and foremost, we have to open beyond this 25% occupancy indoor dining in DC. That is first. The second is that, you know, we have to keep many of the allowances that have been put in place. Let's have the conversations around what can become permanent, because consumer behavior has changed. But as we are recovering, we have to put our arms around anything that provides some kind of relief that is low-hanging relief. So thinking about outside dining and thinking about permitting and anything associated with costs, we have to keep that in place. alcohol to go. The various local funds and grants that have been offered in DC, Maryland, and Virginia, just keep it going. Like, we need them refunded, refueled in terms of funding. We need them going out the door to these small businesses. And this federal relief, I mean, it's going to be huge if we don't run out of money. It is going to be huge. And I think that will be the silver lining for many who are making those really hard decisions around whether I stay open or whether I hibernate or whether I close completely. We've seen 200 closures across the region during this last year. Most of that, 150, has been in DC. Recovery is going to be long, but we're hopeful. We are somewhat the industry that never closed. We were just restricted along the way. So I'm hopeful that as the allowances increase, the restrictions are lifted, we are able to pull in more revenue slowly but surely to be in a better place this spring and this summer.
Well, that's good to hear. And I think a long and bumpy road, but, to keep the hope up at the end of the day for that recovery. And I think, Kathy, you actually answered Todd Turner's question here in the chat about what role should government play in the post-pandemic recovery. I think you answered that beautifully. So thank you for doing two things at the same time. Because I think the panelists agree that that is an important part of the recovery. We also wanted to just touch on, business travel a little bit more, Erika, in terms of, we know that business travel in Greater Washington area accounts for, 40% of the revenue in this area. And, per our perspective, that's going to come back later than leisure travel, right? But that's something that you as Marriott International are seeing across the board. What is it that you're doing to continue to drive growth and counteract this decline in business travel?
Yeah, Dyllis, you're right. Across the country, we've really seen occupancy grow steadily since January. Shy of a few weeks there, we've generally been on a good growth clip, if you will. And most of that has been driven by leisure, to your point. BT, general business travel, is starting to come back. And of course, big conventions, to your point, just because of lead time, is going to take a bit longer. That, of course, coupled with restrictions. But the good news is we're getting calls and seeing leads for groups of 200, 400, 1,000. So people want to travel. But you're right, at the end of the day, business travel to DC really has remained limited. But hotels are starting to see some movements. I understand Mayor Bowser is going to be opening up capacity for meetings up to 250 people on May 1st. But that notwithstanding, leisure is going to continue to lead the recovery. So I think countering that decline means coming up with ways to spark interest and inspire leisure travel. And I think, one of the things that we've tried to do is sort of rethink the work from anywhere space. As you may have seen, last year we launched something called Work Anywhere with Marriott Bonvoy. It was really an effort to meet the needs of customers who are doing what we've all had to do, right? Juggle work and school and managing all the complexities of this life we've all been leading for the last year. And so what we've tried to do is offer day passes or stay passes, play passes. All of these are packages that are designed to be flexible options, right? So guests who just want to get away from their home for a meeting or a day's worth of, peace and quiet to get caught up with work, to really try to appeal to people who otherwise might not have thought about, hotel options. Marriott Bonvoy Escapes, this is really a marketing effort that was launched to give our, most frequent best customers exclusive savings opportunities across the US, Canada, and Caribbean and Latin America. Who's not inspired, by a beach image these days? I get on these calls and every time I see a backdrop, the first thing I want to do is go start planning my trip with all these fabulous images we're all seeing. But it's a great way to support, short-term business needs by offering, great deals throughout the week. But we also know that, drive travel really matters. Now, DC is going to be impacted, right? Because the Smithsonian's, the museums aren't fully open. So we'll be excited when that happens, because that will really unlock the drive market, which has been really critical. So think states like Florida, Georgia, Texas, California, Arizona, where there's a lot of leisure demand right now. So I think when the museums open up and the drive market really sort of gets its energy back, we're going to see a lot of lift really quickly in the DMV area. We're also working really closely, Dyllis, with U.S. Travel on messaging and marketing. They had a national plan for vacation day messaging earlier this year, and just the sheer act of planning a vacation apparently is exceptionally good for mental health, aside from business growth. And I just, talked about this. We're just looking for ways to capitalize on leisure and expand ways to grow the business.
Thank you, Erika. And I think we've all had to change the way that we all message and communicate with each other, right? And so maybe, Susan, I see that there's a question in the chat, and I thought this might be a great one for you to answer in terms of how you've changed the channels that you use to connect to customers, because I know you've done a huge amount of work on your website, and so just thought you might want to comment on that quickly before we go to our
for sure. So I mean, again, last year we cut all advertising budgets. I'm sorry about that, Business Journal and Washingtonian, but we had to just do it internally. We had to do it through social media, and that's how really we've been communicating to our customers is really through social media. And my internal team, I've had to utilize, everybody wears different hats, and so we're doing that. And we actually brought on a company called GoTab that's helping us with the not only our website to order online, but also at events. So events have stopped doing buffets. Everything's individually packaged. Everybody has to be in a seat. So when they're in their seat, they can click on a QR code. And I'm sure, Kathy, a lot of the restaurants got rid of menus as well, and there's a QR code. So that technology we've introduced to what we've been doing. But back in April of 2020, I had a colleague who owns a catering company out in Arizona just reached out to me and said, "Hey, Susan, you want to get on a call and see what's going on in your region?" And so every 2 weeks for the last year, since last March, myself, someone from Arizona, San Diego, and Atlanta, the four of us would get on a call and talk about, how are we navigating PPP? What are we doing to bring people back? What are you seeing trends on food? So it's been really helpful. And more importantly, it's the advocacy that we need in our industry. There's a Restaurant Act. Of course, caterers are covered under that. They bail out the hotels, but nobody's really thinking about catering or live events. And I know that we've done somewhat of an attempt to bring live events in front of Congress, but we've developed a new association called ESEP, Event Catering Professionals. And what we're going to do is our main focus is to really advocate for us in the industry and make sure that we're not looked over. And we're fortunate that we weren't looked over on this last Restaurants Act, but it's important for advocacy for us to get out there and make sure that we're heard, that we're an industry. We need help just like everybody else.
Yeah, and I mean, talking about advocacy for the industry, Kathy, I mean, maybe as we think about one of the biggest challenges, as we outlined in terms of the workforce and bringing people back in to the industry, keeping the talent that we have, what's your perspectives on that? And, how are you overcoming some of these challenges, or how are you advising the industry to overcome these challenges?
Yes, it's been, so our two biggest challenges right now as we talk to our operators are the COVID restrictions overall and kind of breaking down the various restrictions based on jurisdiction. And then it is hiring. In 2019, pre-pandemic, workforce was our biggest challenge in this industry, finding qualified workers to be able to fill the immense growth that was happening across the region. Well, we're here, in 2021, and workforce is our biggest issue again for very, very different reasons. So skills are different, needs are different, operators are looking to lean out and think about how to be very efficient while still creating an amazing experience for diners, as their ultimate goal is still to bring people to the restaurant versus trying to offer the majority of their services outside of their restaurant. But, you know, there have been a lot of people, a lot of workers who have left the industry. They've left for many reasons, but the big thing we've seen is that they've left the region. They've moved back home, wherever home may be with family, to take care of loved ones, or just to be able to ride out a very, very uncertain time. Now we have a situation where operators, on one hand, they want to hire back. On the other, they don't have the financial rationale to be able to hire back if you're only operating at 25% of a footprint indoor. But the needs are going to be very different. They need people who are at the curbside doing curbside pickup. They need delivery drivers because they don't necessarily want to expend too much financial capital on third-party platforms. They have to rethink their models, which means rethinking what is needed of a workforce. So it's going to be a long journey. I do think there will be ways to incentivize and reinstill the same passion that many who worked in our industry started out in this industry because of that. However, training has to look different. And that means reimagining every possible training program that is in place right now, because it doesn't work. There are some that do, but you know, we have to find a way to be able to match the training with the services now and the long-term services and needs for a workforce that is qualified in this market to hire back. So we're hopeful again, but there's a lot of work to be done there, and we have to do it across the board.
Yeah, and thank you, Kathy. And I think that'll be echoed also with Erika, and I'll come to you, Max, as well, and ask you the same question for your business in a minute. But Erika, I mean, how are you seeing both the headquarters in Bethesda? Of course, you're based in Bethesda, so you've got a large workforce here in Bethesda, as well as also on property. How are you seeing the challenge of the workforce come to fruition, and how are you thinking about having the right people in place to be able to bounce back?
Yeah, you're right, Dyllis. I mean, but first, before DC, across, the country where demand has really come back, I would agree, one of our biggest challenges is, finding talent. There are a lot of options out there. Our recovery isn't full. So I think people are still a little bit reluctant, right? They're not quite as sure about our occupancy glide path, if you will, pardon me. So I think those markets have seen what I believe we'll probably experience in DC and other markets when we're fully open and demand is growing exponentially. That it is going to be a real focus to make sure that we can attract talent to our industry. Now, over the last 12 months, our headquarters right next door in Bethesda, we've had a full-time remote work model. This summer we're going to migrate more toward a hybrid work model where associates will work some days in the office and some days remotely. In our hotels, we're really focused on what we call workforce innovation, and how do you rethink jobs to make them more attractive, more diverse, such that people get much more experience and development that makes them better prepared for growth and advancement. And frankly, it makes the work more fun. I think the name of the game is so much that we're going to do, both in terms of how we operate and how we sell and how we have offerings for customers, whether it's hybrid meetings or a regular meeting. It's going to be about living in a mindset of flexibility, working remotely, hybrid meetings. All of that, we've learned to navigate out of necessity, but I think we've also learned that it's never going to replace the innate desire to plan, to innovate, to learn, to connect in person. So flexibility is the key.
Flexibility, completely agree with that, as well as connectivity, right?
That's
With
right.
with all of us eventually meeting in person again. We're excited about that. Max, what about from an MGM perspective? How are you seeing managing the challenges in the workforce and really, bringing them back as you grow back into recovery?
Sure, sure. As Kathy and Erica have said, it's a challenge, pre-pandemic, and it's a challenge now in this area in specific. We opened up a business here and looked to say, okay, we need 500 dealers. They're just a job that doesn't exist in the market, that we had to kind of find ways and creative ways to build a talent and a skill in a market where it wasn't present before. And it's not just specific to that job, it's many different jobs where just the skill set isn't requisite to the area as it is in other centers of hospitality and other portions of the country. I think really what it does is it requires us to be more creative. It requires us to think harder about how do we expend resources to develop people that maybe don't have the skills but have the desire, ways to kind of prop up internal programs to train people who want to become a dealer or a food server or have some other role in the hospitality industry. So we've been very active in that space, also partnering with local community colleges so that we can actually bring people into this industry and then be able to see them grow and develop forward. The one thing that we are seeing, and we've seen it throughout time, but more and more now, is the desire to want part-time hours and very much flexible part-time hours. And I think that as we really look at the rebuild of our business and bringing people back, it really is incumbent to think about how do we market our roles in this industry? Are we as flexible as we think we are? And are we messaging the right things to attract someone to want to come in and work? So those are things that we're working on and thinking about, but definitely echo the comments that have been made about just the extreme challenges of being able to staff and hire in this market.
Yeah, and I think particularly you talked about some of the training needs, and there's a question here around, some of these anticipated training needs that you're seeing. Maybe you could just briefly comment on that, Max.
Sure. We currently offer a number of programs for people who want to come in and work. So we will pay people to hire in and go through training to eventually be able to do their job. We do that for dealers. It works successfully, and it was one of the avenues that we took to be able to actually have people to be able to facilitate in the role. We have looked at and are in process of looking at other roles in a similar way. And those are situations where we're doing that work ourselves. There are other programs that we have with community partners who are also in the business of bringing talent to organizations. And as well, as I mentioned, we have existing programs currently through community colleges, and many of which now are options to where there's almost really not even a fee structure for some of those folks to be able to take advantage of those opportunities and then be able to grow into a career.
Super. Well, as we come to the last 5 minutes of the call, I just wanted to thank all the panelists for all the discussion today. It's so many common industries across all the different subsections of the industry, and really think about leaving this on a hope note, on a note of hope. I'd love to ask each of you, what's your biggest hope for the industry as we move to bounce back? Susan, maybe you could start.
Yeah, absolutely. My hope is that the mayor can open up the city so people can go and enjoy and visit. My hope is that everybody will get back to work, back to the office, not only in the city, but also in Montgomery County. And Virginia is a little bit eased up the restrictions. So my hope is that we can get back to normalcy as soon as possible.
So do we, Susan. I echo that, and I look forward to getting back to our office in Arlington. Max, maybe to you next in terms of your hope, and then I'll go to Kathy and end with Erika.
My hope for sure is that we have a fantastic 2022 and maybe one of the best years that we've ever had as an industry. is what I'm hoping for all of us in the subsets that we all work in.
Well, I'm hoping that I have a fabulous result in your casino there, Max, and it will be a
Absolutely.
fantastic 2022. I love it how we skip over 20 and 21, you know. Kathy, maybe to you next in terms of your biggest hope for the industry and bouncing back.
Yes, I think that as we talk about recovery as a larger hospitality industry, my hope is that while it's been devastating, that we use it as an opportunity to reset all of what didn't work going into the pandemic so that we are really bolder and brighter and better as an industry. I do feel that gradually, as we reopen, we're going to be better. We're going to be that much better. I just want exactly what Susan wants. We need to take the steps forward and reopen further so that we are starting that road to recovery.
Yeah, and I echo the point, Kathy. I think we do need to come back stronger than we were before, right? Erika, maybe some closing words for you, from you before we close?
Terrific. First thing, I hope we get vaccinated. I think the vaccination rates going up will make all the difference. Second, I hope that we're able to restore a sense of stability so that we're able to recruit talented people to work in this industry we all love. And lastly, I believe so deeply, Dyllis, in the restorative power of travel to, build bridges and make connections, bring communities and people together. Because I think what we've learned over this last year is that the memories will last a lifetime, and travel is a part of that. So, and I think we could all use it. So that's what my hope is, that travel comes back so we can start making memories again.
Well, super. Thank you all very much for the very lively discussion today. I wish all of you a strong recovery and growth in the coming months as we all get vaccinated and all get out and travel and socialize and meet again in person. And so with that, Jack, I'll hand it back to you and say thank you so much to the Greater Washington Board of Trade for having us all today and for allowing us to have this conversation.
That's great, Dyllis. And thank you so much for facilitating and for the information you shared up front. I thought that was really interesting and kind of set the stage nicely. And really thank you to all of our panelists, Erika, Susan, Max, and Kathy. A really good conversation. I know how much you've all been through this past year, and we're still working through that. We'll get there. Why don't I suggest now that we invite you all back at the beginning of next year so we can have a conversation about how great the year is going to be, Max, to your point, because I share that sentiment with you. There's a few more bumps. We got to keep the pressure on. We got to keep moving forward. We got to get people vaccinated. We'll get there. But restaurants in particular are just so vital to our communities. Kathy, the way you talked about that, our communities do revolve around those restaurants. They each really do help define the character of it. And it really is a matter of quality of life for us here. So, a really critical component of our day-to-day activities that we need to make sure that we stay focused on. So this briefing will be available on our website later if anybody wants to check it out, or somebody couldn't make it today and they want to check it out. And again, I just thank you all so much for your time. And I look forward to working with you all to get things back on track. And so with that, stay well, and everyone have a great day.
Great. Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Dyllis.
you.
Thanks, Jack.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.